everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have the incredible Deena Shakir with us and Candy Cheng. Deena Shakir is a partner at Lux Capital, a multi-stage venture capital firm with 4 billion under management, where she invests in transformative technologies improving lives and livelihoods. She's had a very non-linear journey into venture capital, which we'll hear about later. Prior to Lux, she was a partner at GV. She led product partnerships at Google for early stage products in healthcare, AI, machine learning, and search at Google, and directed social impact investments at google.org. Candy Cheng is a senior correspondent on the startups and venture capital team at Business Insider. And prior to Business Insider, she was also the executive producer of Bloomberg Studio 1.0, where she's produced conversations with industry leaders, including Apple CEO Tim Cook, Microsoft co-founder Bill Gates, and Alibaba founder Jack Ma. She was also the head of technology interviews, regularly booking top tech executives, investors, entrepreneurs, and other newsmakers for Bloomberg Media Group, including Facebook Chief Operating Officer Sheryl Sandberg. So I'm sure this will be a fantastic conversation. Over to you guys.
Thank you so much for having us, Sarah, and for this fabulous event. I'm so excited to be here with Deena, who is such an incredible VC, but also a friend. So I want to start because I think you have such an interesting, non-traditional path to VC. First, working in Washington, we've talked a lot about your background in politics because I also have a background in politics. And then as an operator at Google. So for the aspiring entrepreneurs and investors in this audience, can you tell us about your path and some of the early lessons you learned?
Absolutely. And those are some big shoes to fill with Tim Cook and Bill Gates and Sheryl Sandberg. So hopefully I won't disappoint, Candy, but it's always good to chat with you. So I'll start by saying that I was not an aspiring VC or entrepreneur. In fact, I don't think I really even fully understood exactly what venture capital was when I was a student and kind of thinking about my next steps. For me, my sort of vision, my orientation was always around this idea of building bridges. And that really stems back to my childhood. So I'll kind of rewind a little bit there and kind of explain how the dots connect to where I am today. But it starts with growing up. I'm a Bay Area native, which apparently is a novelty around these parts. But my journey really starts before that in Baghdad, which is where both of my parents immigrated from. And my childhood was really kind of marked by the sort of good fortune of the serendipity of the fact that I was able to be here in the Bay Area and not in Baghdad. And I knew that really was something that was a privilege and that I wanted to pay forward. And especially sort of coming of age, with one war after another, and seeing the neighborhoods where my parents grew up blown to smithereens. And then of course with 9/11 and the war on terror. So that really informed what I wanted to do, what I wanted to study. I went to school on the East Coast and thought I was going to end up actually as an academic. That was my dream. I wanted to be an anthropologist of all things, which might seem like a far cry from venture, but we'll talk about this in a minute. They're actually very similar in a lot of ways, which I'm sure you as a journalist can relate to. And so graduating, that was the path. I went straight to grad school, happened to be in DC as President Obama was elected and inaugurated. And I was, always doing side hustles. I paid for college and grad school by myself, had a lot of jobs, sometimes up to 3 at a time. Some of them were, crappy work study jobs. And some of them were actually, quite interesting and allowed me to kind of explore career paths. And so I dabbled, as you know, in journalism. To me, journalism was sort of, vocational anthropology. And so I was interning with the BBC when I was covering the White House, because that's what you do when you're in DC. And I was really inspired by that moment in history, in particular with a speech that President Obama gave in Cairo in 2009, where he announced the global entrepreneurship, what became the Global Entrepreneurship Summit, and really put forth a better way of building bridges between the Muslim world and the US that's grounded in dignity and entrepreneurship and technology. So I abandoned my academic aspirations, went into the administration and did that for a few years. And that was a really interesting time in sort of the history of Silicon Valley and the history of kind of technological innovation. We now sort of call those years, 2009, 2010, 2011, the beginning of the fourth industrial revolution, when software starts eating the world, when the A16Zs of the world, were born. And I happened to be working on technology for the US government. And so I was coming out to the Bay where I grew up, but really where I never thought I would end up, because in my day, there really wasn't a lot to do here if you weren't an engineer, if you weren't working on chips and maybe early days of software. But I was seeing that center of gravity shifting out west, not just geographically, but also that this was becoming a way of achieving impact. At the same time, the Arab Spring was beginning in the region. As someone who was working on policies and programs for the Middle East, it was pretty interesting to see how technology was actually changing or enabling change on the ground. And that's what led me to Silicon Valley, to my hometown of Mountain View, and to Google at first, where I worked on social impact products at what used to be google.org, which is a very different entity than the google.org of today. So I really need to figure out how to make this story shorter, but to fast forward to how I ended up in venture, I spent 5 years, had an amazing experience working on early stage product, moonshots, as they call them at Google. So I got to work on, things like Verily when it was Project Baseline, like Loon when it was a stealth product, like Fiber and 50 other things that you all have never heard of because they never saw today, or they are now in the Google graveyard, which exists. And that is what led me to venture. I ended up leading a version of what became Google Health and really dove headfirst, despite having absolutely no real background in healthcare, much chagrin of my physician and family members. That's not the path I took. But I became obsessed with this intersection of technology and healthcare. And because I knew so little, I did what I do a lot of now, and probably you do a lot of, Candy, which is talk to experts and try to get smart on the space. And that meant actually talking to a lot of entrepreneurs who were building healthcare companies back then. And that really inspired me to focus on early stage, because I could tell that the real innovation in this industry, it just was not going to come from big tech. It was going to come from startups. So I ended up joining Google Ventures at the time, and then Lux a couple years ago.
Amazing. So anytime I speak with aspiring journalists, I always tell them that it's not crucial to go to journalism school. Like, all of your life experiences are actually more beneficial than that degree. And this is my personal opinion. And journalism can be learned. Do you agree that that is the same sentiment in VC as well?
It's interesting because nobody's born a venture capitalist, right? There's definitely no template. And if you look at some of the most, successful and iconic investors, there are many different paths.
Yeah.
What I tell, folks who are thinking about going into venture, everybody has a superpower. And I know that's cheesy, but it's true. And, for me, it happened to be this idea of partnership building, of bringing very different stakeholders together around a shared mission. For others, like there are some amazing journalists who've become investors, and they are very good at, knowing how to diligence things, how to see through bullshit, excuse my French, and understand the truth, and how to tell a story, which is a very important part of venture. And others come from finance. Others are entrepreneurs. So yes, I don't think it's something you can necessarily study or plan for, but I do think, like government service, actually bringing a perspective from the outside into the industry is super valuable. Although there are also some amazing investors who've done nothing but venture their whole careers.
For those who are curious, I majored in international relations. So that's the political background of my journey. So the last story we worked on together, Deena, was about your big investment in Maven. And it was such an incredible story of how you met Kate. We talked about kind of how you spotted that investment early and really have formed this relationship that's beyond just writing it in, really providing value to the company. So can you tell us, how do you source a deal like that? How do you meet the next Kate? Because I'm sure everyone wants that unicorn encounter, but may not know exactly where to go.
Absolutely. Well, I'm so proud of that investment, and it's just been absolutely delightful to work with Kate and the board there. But we invested at the Series D, so that's a very different type of deal sourcing than the early stage, investments you make at pre-seed or seed. And there a lot of credit goes to the early believers and the early investors who were part of the cohort that Kate met with, many of whom said no, who relegated women's health to a niche industry. Those are the early believers who spotted it. For me, it was a bit different. I really mapped out. I had this thesis around women's and family health. And it was a thesis that developed over a number of years, where I had invested in two companies, and two very different companies, one of which is focused on the technology of IVF, and which is an absolute breakthrough on the diagnostic side, and that's called A-Life, and another company called Aiden, which is focused on personalized birth control. And it's met dozens of companies working on everything from fertility financing to menopause care, and really was, again, doing kind of what I did back then at Google, getting smart on, on what the space looks like. I even worked on a market map that I think that you saw with Chris Barr and Leslie Schrock, who have become close friends and part of my women's health tribe of investors. And so it was clear to me, as I did all of that kind of diligence, as I talked to customers, that Maven was, head and shoulders above any of the players around specifically, employer benefits, and that Kate was an incredible entrepreneur. And I got to know Jess through another co-investment, Jess Lee from Sequoia, who now also has become a friend. And so she and I were co-investors in a company called Moss, which is also an incredibly just inspiring entrepreneur, Amira. I think you've had the chance to meet her as well. And so in the process of those conversations, Jess shared to me more about her experience. She co-led the Series B with Nancy Brown over at Oak, and I got introduced to Kate, and that was not in the process of some sort of hot fundraise cycle. It was, getting to know each other over time as individuals who were passionate about the space, and we really, and so that, of course, it did become a very competitive process, and we partnered with Dragoneer to co-lead the Series D, and I talk to Kate pretty much daily, and really feel like we're partners in the true sense of the word in this journey to transform women's and family care.
You just said a word that kind of shot a light bulb in my head, the word tribe, and how important it is in your life to have a tribe of not only peers and founders, but friendship around the people you work with, and supporting, learning, educating, everything from tips on founders you should meet to even mom tips and how, which toys to buy for Christmas, and just how to really support and lift each other through your career and through your life.
Absolutely. I mean, it's essential in this industry. One of the things that is sort of remarkable about shifting from an operating role to an investing role is that it can be lonely. You're not necessarily collaborating on building a product in the way that you would with a cross-sectional team if you're launching a product at Google, where you've got legal and you've got product and you've got eng and you've got marketing, and certainly there are some very large firms out there that have large operational teams, but even then, at the end of the day, this is a business of conviction, and it's also a business where as much as you want to be involved, and you're not there on the ground. So to that end, it's really critical to have those relationships. Of course, the relationship with your partners, if you're not a solo GP, is critical. And for me, that was a big part of the reason why I joined Lux, is I really connected on a human level with every one of the partners, and that's key. But nobody invests in a vacuum. Like, very rarely are you going to invest once and then that's it. So depending on what stage you invest in, it's also really important to have those relationships with earlier stage investors and with later stage investors. And so for me, as I've come into this industry, and not as a lifer in venture, building those relationships has been an incredibly fruitful investment. So the tribe I mentioned is a tribe of women who invest in women's health, where it's probably one of my most active text threads, which says a lot because, Candy, I'm in a lot of mom groups. Those are some pretty active text threads.
I agree. As a mom myself,
it's quite prolific. But to be able to connect with people as humans, and that means on every level. And so I'm really unapologetic about bringing that whole self to the relationship with founders as well as with investors, because what else is there? And it is an inherently personal and human connection you make, and a long-term one.
For those of you, the people in the audience, for those who are interested in getting into venture or pitching to venture, can you give us some insight on the best way to reach you? How do you like to communicate? Not everyone can be on a text chain with you. So I'm curious, do you take DMs? Are you active on other social media that where people can reach you? And what is kind of the best way to filter through, like all of our inboxes are crazy right now, but how do you kind of give us some insight into how do you structure your day and your workflow in communication?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I'm still constantly navigating that because, time doesn't scale. And if somebody can figure out how to bend it, that'll be an investment I would love to make. But, there's all sorts of productivity solutions. But at the end of the day, there's not only so much time, there's only so much energy.
Right.
And I have really had to force myself because I am somebody with a lot of curiosity and interests. Like there are a lot of things that, that I want to explore, but I've had to be more and more disciplined about not only meeting new companies, but making sure that I have enough bandwidth to give to the companies that I have invested in, because that is a long-term commitment, and I'm not a passive investor. I truly do engage on almost a daily level with the founders whose boards that I'm on, and that's important to me, and that's part of the value I bring. So yes, I am. DMs are open, so I do respond to cold DMs on Twitter. As somebody who gets a lot of pitches, I am sure you can relate to this, but there are ways to filter. And for me, part of that is like if someone has done their homework and it's not just like, hey, can I pick your brain? Please don't say pick your brain. That is like the most, like I literally, it feels like my brain is being picked by vultures when somebody says that. Like, um, so, being very thoughtful about it. It's not just like, oh, I happen to be the one random VC that and you want to pick, but actually like you've looked through, I'm very public. My opinions are not secrets. They're out there. I tweet a lot. I write, I've published. So if you feel like there's a fit there for a particular topic or a shared interest, then, that really does get my attention. And I have been very fortunate to have sent cold emails and been the recipient of those. And that's something that's important to me. But at the same time, if it's just like a sort of thoughtless, shot in the dark, I don't necessarily have the bandwidth to be able to engage in that way.
I feel like we need a whole different session on the art of a pitch because
Oh, yeah.
I agree with everything you just said and more. So
Sure.
I do want to talk about your area of expertise and where you spend most of your time, because I do think this is a really underserved and underinvested area in venture. Women's health, for whatever reason, until very recently, has had such a hard time in Silicon Valley. And I just remember, early days of coverage where you hear these horror stories of an investor going to their assistant to ask for their opinion or even take a pitch meeting because they didn't understand the business model, or someone have to slam a bunch of magazines in front of board members because they couldn't get their attention, right? And I feel like you cover areas that are uncomfortable, right? Just even in normal societal conversations to have about IVF, about fertility, miscarriages, postpartum depression, mental health. These are things that people just don't want to talk about, let alone invest in. So how do you convince a bunch of people to come to you and for you to deploy the capital that you do and really make this not only a thing, but like you've built your career on this, right? And this very uncomfortable issues.
Yes, very, very good question. So, I remember hearing from someone once that they felt like it was problematic that, the woman partner is focusing on women's health. And I really challenge that, that assumption, because I do think we bring our own experiences to the examples you just mentioned to the investments that we make. And as I've, written about and talked about publicly, I had two very scary pregnancies, labors, deliveries. I have dealt with everything across the maternal spectrum with my own health, across the pediatric spectrum with my children. And frankly, that is part of what opened my eyes to what is broken in this space. Now, that being said, I also recently heard from someone that they thought I wouldn't be interested in their company that's focused on men's health. Well, that's just not the case. I think that, there is a history of investors dismissing certain areas because they couldn't understand them. And those investors likely missed out on some pretty large opportunities. And that is one of the many reasons why we need cap tables to be more representative of the world that we live in, because inherently we do bring those personal experiences to the table, and to ourselves, to our partnerships, to our co-investors. It's one of the reasons why, I am very public and write about these topics and talk about them, because hopefully that helps, over time, to move the needle around general perception. Because at the end of the day, women's health, let's talk about women's health. We're half the population. We control 80% of the dollars in this country in healthcare. We are, experiencing, not just across our reproductive years, but, across our entire lives, a slew of health-related experiences that have not really been the beneficiary of much innovation for a long time. And part of that likely is because it hasn't been an area that has traditionally been invested in. So the tides are turning. There's a great report that Rock Health just put out recently on this space. And I think that, Maven, certainly as the first unicorn of women's and family health, is leading the way. But there have been some other, excellent companies that are achieving growth rounds and high valuations. And I do think that this is just the beginning. There is so much more to come.
The tide is slowly beginning to turn, as you mentioned. PitchBook also released some new numbers recently this week about the number of venture dollars to female founders. And while it dropped 3% last year, it actually increased slightly this year. I want to know, how do we keep this momentum going? You mentioned you personally write a lot, speak a lot about this topic, but you're just one person and you only have 24 hours a day. How do we get others to really build and support this momentum so that it becomes less of an issue and less of a taboo to talk about these topics publicly?
Yeah, I think the PitchBook report is a great example of what we need more of, which is the data, grounding it in data, and getting more women around cap tables and investing in more women in general, underrepresented founders, is not about charity or philanthropy or some DEI or ESG or whatever acronym you want to use, initiative. It is fundamentally better business. And at the end of the day, as venture capitalists, the word capitalist is in our titles. We are stewards of capital for our limited partners, many of which are some of the most philanthropic institutions, endowments, educational establishments. And so it is our job to make money for them. And at the end of the day, and this is also in that PitchBook report, which I encourage everyone to read, as well as a slew of other reports that have come out recently, these founders are better founders. They recruit more diverse teams, which produce better products. Diverse boards, literally across the board, no pun intended, also produce better outcomes. Their exit time is faster. Their exit valuations are bigger. It is literally a better investment. We love to look at data. This data-driven, investing is now a big trend. Well, if we look at it, then we should really all be investing in underrepresented founders, because they're just creating better businesses.
One of the best quotes I ever heard from an interview was with Jeffrey Katzenberg, who has created most of the legendary Disney movies, Aladdin, everything. But he said, invest in mom and you'll do well. And that, I heard when he told us that way before I became a mother myself, but that has always stuck with me, because look at the movies. Like, he had that in mind for every movie which is just, that's why that all of them were smash hit, right? So I just always think about that. Okay, so I want to talk about personal branding, because I think there's a lot of questions here around how active should you be on social media, on Twitter. You're very active. You're not shy about sharing your advice, your opinions, not just for your career, but also personal life tips, life hacks. How important has that been for you? And do you recommend it for someone who's just starting out, either as a founder or as an investor?
Yeah, I've gotten some comments from some folks recently about, oh, you're killing it on Twitter. And I actually find that's a great compliment because I actually have really made an effort to be more public. It's not something that comes naturally to me. You know, let's backtrack. I worked at the State Department and at a large company, Google. Like I was always in environments where it wasn't, celebrated to be an individual brand. You were part of a larger organization. And I've been an operator, which meant for me, for the most part, like I put my head down and just did really good work. And I sort of had this profound belief that that's really what mattered, and this like notion of meritocracy. And let's be honest, of course that matters. And building a brand is not necessarily the only path. There are some of the most incredible investors at every stage who don't even exist online, or who will never write a blog post, and there are others whose careers started with writing newsletters or as well-known journalists and so on. So for me, I made an intentional effort to be more open for a number of reasons. Number one, I didn't get exposure to a lot of people who look like me or look like you when I was thinking about what I wanted to do. And I do think that sort of unconsciously shaped my aspirations and my vision. And so and there is research now that shows that our own kind of limitations around our potential as women starts as early as 18 months of age. And the same goes for unfortunate preconceptions, both internal and external, around depending on other demographics and race, racism, even really starting at that early of an age. So that's part of it. Is just like, one of the tweets, in fact, that I think maybe got the most likes was based on an experience with my daughter, where she literally asked me, Mom, can boys also grow up to be VCs one day? Like that.
Yeah.
I was shocked. That blew my mind in so many ways. She's 6, so all she knows is like whatever a VC is, that's what mom is. But it really kind of affirmed for me why it is important for us to be loud and proud and out there. And I think this is especially true for, again, based on data, not just in venture, but across the professional world, where women are, even in the Supreme Court, are interrupted more than men, where, there's mansplaining across, and I don't say this because, I have a son, I'm married to a man, I've got a dad. I love men. I love women too. But the point is, again, looking at data, that we are unfortunately limiting ourselves because of the experiences that we have. And so that's part of why brand building is important. But it's also important because of, on a very tactical level, because I have gotten some incredible inbound from founders who may not have known me or even known Lux, but saw kind of the things that I've written and published based on, my experiences and the research that I've done. And that's been great for deal flow too. It's valuable, and it's valuable also, in the long term, in terms of being able to help your companies do more of that thought leadership. So I think there are many ways why it's important, but it's not the only way. It's also a great way to learn. Like I learned so much based on the people that I follow, and also based on some of the input that I get back from some of the stuff I put out.
That's so great. So for the founders who want to seek long-term and lasting relationships with VCs, what can you just give us some advice, like 3 top secrets to really forming a long-term relationship, and what founders should focus on? I know there's a lot of chasing of dollar signs, chasing valuations right now. Money is flowing, and rounds are getting more and more competitive. But I kind of want to take a step back and hear your perspective on what is important and what the job of a venture capitalist like you actually is, and what you can provide.
Yeah, I feel like I explain what I do for a living to some of my family members who don't even know what venture capital is, and sometimes they see me hustling, and I've never worked harder in my life, but I love it. Like that's part of why I work so much, and they kind of struggle to understand. Like, hold on a second, you're writing a check, and you're the one who's like trying to convince these founders, that they should be working with you. But that is the nature of the business these days. Again, even the most iconic, well-known entities, individuals, and firms still hustle like that. And I have respect for that hustle. And that's something that I actually, as I talk to founders at the earlier stages, that I try to like have them remember, like that. Although we are the ones writing the checks, we are nothing without successful entrepreneurs. So that power balance, it's almost like when you think about kind of a recruiting relationship at a firm, right? There's a period where, you know, the balance is off between the potential employee and the recruiter. But then there's a moment where the recruiter knows, or the, you know, the boss, the manager knows that that's the candidate they want, and the tides turn. And
Right.
that happens in venture as well. So it's encouraging founders to recognize there is a reciprocity and a symbiosis to the relationship, from a power dynamic, from a content dynamic. You know, empathy is very important on both sides. You know, I think sometimes, you know, founders will get frustrated if there's not an immediate response from a VC. And I personally pride myself on being responsive, but it is also important to know that, like, there are, you know, many different competing priorities in anyone's life, just, you know, across personal and professional. And so I think maintaining that empathy and thinking about the pitch also from the eyes or the ears of the VC is important. And that means not only, you know, being able to tell your story well and be articulate, but also recognizing that this is probably one of maybe 15, you know, pitches that they're seeing or reading a day, and how is it that you differentiate? And again, the same goes for us. Like, the founder is meeting with a lot of people. Why would they want to choose to work with me? And so that is when something that really goes both ways.
I want I want to demystify venture, because I feel like, looking in, there may be some, you know, glamorization going on of people saying, oh, it's such, you know, it looks like she has such a great job and it's so easy, because we only hear about the good moments, right? Like when you win a deal, when one of your companies goes public and everyone celebrates, but no one talks about the hard things, the daily stuff that you have to go through. I remember when I worked in television, everyone was like, oh, your job is so cool, Candy. But they don't know that I'm like crouched underneath like a staircase with camera, like trying to like arch my back in order to get the perfect shot, right?
Yes.
And I'm there for 45 minutes, like standing still. So what are some of the unglamorous parts of venture that you can share with us?
That's such an important question. And part of the reason why I feel like I try to be an open book with that, in the same way that you've definitely seen me talk about the unglamorous parts of motherhood too, right? Well, but first, let me preface it by saying, like, this job is a privilege. It is so much fun. And I feel so lucky that I get to spend all day talking to the inventors of the future. Like, I don't take that for granted or take it lightly. But as I said, it is by a huge multiple the hardest I've ever hustled and worked. And I think a very unique time, not only for venture, but certainly for healthcare, where I spend a lot of my time. So, you know, I have lost many deals that I have wanted to lead. And, you know, I have been ghosted. I have been the recipient of sexism and both, you know, overt aggressions and, you know, death by 1,000 microaggressions. That happens all the time. And so, you know, there are countless examples. I remember once I was in a meeting with a bunch of Fortune 500 execs, and I think I may have shared this story with you before, but one of them, who was a very nice, you know, well-intentioned, you know, older gentleman, asked me if I baked the cookies that the caterer had brought. Like, I mean, first of all, like, I love cookies. I just don't know how to I'm not a baker. Like, I like to eat them, but like, would he have asked that? You know, and then he genuinely wondered that, like, seriously, like, so, you know, those kinds of things happen a lot. And that's not just, you know, so there's sort of the woman adventure aspect of it. And then there's the sort of the daily grind. Like, there's a lot of FOMO. Like, there are so many amazing founders out there today. And you don't want to be the one who was too busy or missed an email from the next, you know, massive unicorn, you know, the next Canva and so on. So you want to be able to give attention to everything, but you also make a commitment when you lead a deal and join a board. And, you know, my founders will attest to this. I'm very committed to being super responsive. I will, you know, take a call whenever it is. And that can be hard, especially if you know, you also want to be a committed mother, wife, you know, daughter, sister, whatever, like the other things that are important, and human being, and have time for yourself. And so being available, and also being able to set boundaries is something that I struggle with daily, more so than I ever have in any other job. There's just a lot out there that you can be doing. I'll never have a clear to-do list ever again. So yeah, there's a lot to it that's challenging. It's not for the faint of heart.
Yeah, I think that one thing I've learned, and like you and I often have conversations, we call it like the second shift when our kids go to bed. But this, like your job, my job, a lot of these jobs are not like 9 to 5s. Like your founder who has an emergency may need you at 10 p.m., 11 p.m., 3 a.m., just like you can't ever really turn it off, but you do, like you said, have to set some clear boundaries. I love that. So I want to talk about changes and venture because there's a lot of changes happening right now. And I feel like every week I walk in and another firm is like blowing up their structure or leadership is changing. There's a lot of folks retiring because they can. There's
A lot of
also,
money has been made.
yeah, there's also, the rise of, new competition, which I love because I feel like the venture model has not had serious competition or disruption in the last decade or two. So we have Tiger, we have Co2, we have competition from the rise of solar venture capitalists, as you mentioned before. How much of this do you think is a real game changer? Or do you think that these are all kind of trends that will come and pass and everything will kind of settle out like every kind of cycle that goes through?
I think I've been rereading E-Boys, sort of a history of kind of Silicon Valley and venture capital, and like thinking, historically at the early days of this industry and how things have changed. And I think the cop-out answer is like it's too soon to tell if these are trends or not, but it is 100% a fascinating time to be writing about, as you are, observing and participating in this changing industry. The asset class has been disrupted, for lack of a better word. I don't really like that word that much, but in so many ways. Solo capitalist, as you mentioned, every fund that is known for a certain stage, like it used to be that you would limit yourself somehow. We're the seed, pre-seed, we're the seed, we're the hedge funds. Hedge funds are doing seed. Seed funds are doing growth. The boundaries are being blurred in every way. Angels, in some cases, or that may not even be solo GPs, are leading rounds. Corporate, VC has gone through many iterations as well, and there are some examples of ones that have really broken past this sort of the corporate glass ceiling in venture that has been there for so long. So there's a lot of capital out there too, and I think that's a function of, I guess I can't really not say metaverse on this panel, a function of like, Web3, the metaverse, like this next kind of generation of internet, creation. And so I think there's still a lot more to come. There's, democratization of VC with, things like stonks and, revenue-based financings like PIPE. Like there's just so much happening that I don't know what it's going to look like in 5 or 10 years.
I like that answer because it's so raw and honest. Whenever I ask kind of older venture capitalists who have been around for a long time, they kind of laugh it off like, things will go back to normal, Candy, when things, this is just a phase. But I do think that some of the stuff that's happening is really going to change venture as we know it today. And I think that it will stick around. I mean, that's just my prediction, but like how I write about venture, how you invest, I think the lessons from the pandemic year, these are all things that like the world is not going back to complete normal, right? There was a pitch in my inbox this morning that did catch my eye, which was, majority of VC firms are not going back to the office. Like the purpose of a VC office doesn't exist anymore. But I don't know how you feel about that. I just know that like people aren't going back. The way you conduct deals, the way you meet founders, everything has changed. So as a VC who's actively investing now, how often do you have conversations about how to adjust, how to prepare, and how far out are you looking?
As a firm internally?
Yeah.
Or in general? Yeah. I mean, it's certainly an active topic of conversation within our and probably every partnership and every family and every school and every employer. I mean, none of us have any experience having, gone through and emerged from a pandemic. Like, predictions that we saw at the early days have largely been disproven for the most part in terms of both economic climate as well as future of work and all of that, and healthcare, which is again where I spend a lot of my time. So we're all trying to figure it out, and there are things that are not pandemic related that are more, or I mean, I guess everything at this point is somewhat pandemic related, but that are not necessarily directly related from a health perspective, such as you mentioned, the notion of the office. And again, this was actually something that recently reread in eBoys around the dynamic of going to where you go to meet a VC, and when the VC comes to you, and this idea of opening offices in different locations, and these new potential hubs. And is San Francisco dead? Is Miami the hot spot? New York is popping. What's going on with Silicon Valley? That stuff may or may not be transient or temporal. But I do think there is a shift in terms of this sort of, as I said, balance of power around the proliferation of incredible founders, and the proliferation of venture capital dollars, and sort of what that nexus looks like in terms of the future of work in our industry is very much TBD.
Can you share with us some of the biggest mistakes you have made in your career? So this is beyond just venture, just because you've done so much in your life. What was something that you still think about, like, oh man, like I wish I could do over that moment?
Yeah, as much as I loved my graduate program, I don't think going straight to grad school from undergrad is a smart move for pretty much almost anyone. That those early 20s are such a formative time in our lives. And, for me, I was so immersed in my academic work in undergrad that it almost kind of seemed like the natural next step to, potentially become a professor of anthropology, which I can't even really imagine that I actually would have potentially done that. So I do think taking time to allow yourself to learn and explore is really critical. And I think even earlier than that, and again, this goes to what we were talking about around these self perceptions starting at such an early age. I think for whatever reason, convinced myself that I was not the numbers person. I was the writer. I was the public speaker. I was the lover of literature, and that those things were somehow dichotomous, even though I always did well in math. Like, it just we were socialized, certainly as young girls and as women. And I hope that's changing now, but we really are socialized to think that's our thing. Right. And so I wish I had not done that. I wish I had invested earlier in my academic journey in studying, maybe not necessarily majoring in CS, but not forcing myself to focus solely on one at the expense of the other. And the same thing goes for, when I graduated from Harvard in 2008, so a few months before the financial crisis. At the time, the year before in my year, between 45 and 50% of our class went into Wall Street or consulting. That's what you did. And there was this sort of, again, in my mind, this perception that you do well or you do good. Sell out and have a miserable life until and go work for evil, finance, or you can go be the academic or the nonprofit, international development, et cetera. And, it has taken me a long time through actually being in those different worlds to recognize that it is not that black and white, that there is this sort of reimagining, as it's often called, a reimagining of capitalism, that there is a role for private capital and even for finance to play in shaping the future of impact. And so I wish I had known more of that earlier on. And that's literally the topic of the course I'm teaching. I'm co-teaching at the Stanford Design School this quarter. And it's been really just rewarding to talk to students earlier on about that experience. And hopefully they will have more nuance going into their career decisions.
I love that you're teaching. So the next question is, what would you be if you weren't a VC? I know you love your job, but your dream career if you weren't a VC.
I mean, I did think I was going to be the next Christiane Amanpour at one point. Little known fact, I just found that clip after however many years.
I can't wait.
Oh my God, I have to share it with you because yeah. So I was on air actually as an anchor for a bilingual Arabic English news show back in the day, which never got past pilot funding. Could have been because I wasn't very good, but I think it was because my Arabic sucked. That's what I'm going to tell them. But yeah, I do love your, your role. I think, there is such an important just, truth telling and representation behind, the bylines, and being able to seek out and amplify the voices that matter. That's still something that's very powerful, and I think would bring me a lot of joy, or would have brought me a lot of joy at some point.
We'll trade places one day.
Yeah.
Or maybe we can do like a career swap for the day, right? That would be so fun. So I want to end by asking you, just kind of wrapping up this conversation, advice for, I'm keeping in mind the audience in the room right now, for the global entrepreneurs and founders in this room who are inspired by your story and want to get started. How does one get started? If you're not in Silicon Valley, you don't have the network, if you're just kind of cracking a go. I mean, I feel like most MBAs these days, and I believe this is a stat, but don't quote me on because I don't know if this is for a fact, but I saw something that most MBAs are graduating school these days wanting to be a VC. And we've also written a lot of stories about Gen Z wanting to break into VC. So it's a hot career. So tell us, based on your life experiences, and we talked about, how you've gone from, politics, operator to VC, but what is the best way to kind of dabble in without feeling really frustrated because it's hard and, you might not get the first answer right away?
There's this joke about VCs always saying, "Let me know how I can be helpful."
Yeah.
And I actually think that's an interesting thing to think about, because this idea of adding value and also recognizing what your superpower is, even if you are in high school, let alone college, grad school, or in another career, is something that is really meaningful. And what that means is not, necessarily asking to pick someone's brain about how to get into venture, but rather, identify what they're looking at, sharing. And I've had countless cold emails and DMs from people sharing their own, they wrote their own memo about some company that they think is really interesting. And rather than just, asking for someone's time, showing what you can bring to the table is super powerful. And so, and that's also a good way for you as sort of an aspiring VC to actually see if you like this. Like, do you like, searching for the founders? Do you like doing kind of, TAM analysis? And do you like, the process of speaking to and learning from founders? So that's, I think, one really valuable way to get into it. And also to keep your mind open. Again, I really would not have predicted that this is what I would end up doing. And yet there's nothing in the world I would rather be doing right now. But each experience led me to the next one. And I think that's something that's really important for us to keep in mind at those early ages, that we are still, and in your teens, in your 20s, frankly, for life, but certainly at that period of time, you are still learning and absorbing, and you have to be open to that process.
I feel like it really isn't a straight line, and some of the best VCs I know came from all of these different areas, right? In terms of your international background, how much has that helped you in kind of seeing investments through a different lens?
Yeah, it's interesting time to be thinking about international investing, because there have been, some recent very large financings and some exits, from Africa and from MENA and, from LATAM. And it's very validating for me to see that, because I've had long-standing conviction. That's really where it all started for me, was, how can entrepreneurship and technology not only have an impact on the ground in terms of, job creation and enabling, livelihoods and improving lives through product creation, but also in terms of sort of long-term development and diplomacy and so on. And so it's really great to see some firms that never thought about investing outside their zip code, let alone outside the country, starting to do that now. I also think the tides are turning there. And frankly, like the penetration of, of connectivity around the world, 10 years ago, we were talking about like everybody has a smartphone. Well, everybody definitely has a smartphone now. And, and now there's Web3 and decentralization on the finance side. There's a whole new world, if you want to go back to your Aladdin, that's still out there. And also we talked about how competitive it is here. Well, there is a whole other, world outside of Silicon Valley and outside of the US that is innovating, that's, has the opportunity to leapfrog innovation, to not necessarily deal with these analog and, entrenched interests and industries in the US. And there is some big potential there from an investment perspective. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, as an immigrant myself, I definitely have a place in my heart for immigrant founder and investor stories. I just think that, getting that one-way ticket to Silicon Valley in that rags to riches story, like no matter how many times you tell it, is still inspiring. Okay, great. Q&A.
Yes.
Okay. So question is, what about you, Candy? Your alternate career path? Good question. I'll do the same answer as Deena and say maybe, I don't know if I would be a very good VC, but learning about venture, maybe from within the walls of venture. I'll just say that. I think that would be super fascinating. Whose advice? How would you advise someone who doesn't have a technical background to learn more about CS, AI, ML, when it feels a lot like you're always behind those that have academic backgrounds? I think this one's for you, Deena.
Yeah, I think that at least as from the context of a VC, even if you have the most technical PhD and have patents under your name and so on, it is very unlikely that the company you're looking at is going to be in that exact industry and field. And so I think what's important is to be able to have fluency and comfort in the technical world, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a PhD in machine learning, although that's great. But it's really more about, again, connecting the dots and being able to see where the opportunities are. And because of what I said around this sort of idea of socialization at an early age of not being comfortable with that stuff, like, oh, I'm not a numbers person, or no, I don't know how to code. I think getting comfortable with that earlier on is something that's really valuable, frankly, no matter what you end up doing, because tech is not like a separate sector anymore. It's in everything that we do, especially in a remote world now. And so, it's almost like when you think about your health as a human, or even as women, like we need to understand the biology of what happens to us. Like, it's not enough to just like think about, at a surface level. It's really important to be able to understand your own biology. And similarly in Web3 or in, metaverse or just in the world that we're living in, being able to understand what happens, even at a high level, is, I think, critical no matter what you do.
Do you think the lack of apps in and about women's health are due to a lack of diversity in Silicon Valley?
Well, I think the history of investments in this space, and I would encourage actually everyone to read Candy's story, her interview with the writer, because Kate was was and is very open about what it was like fundraising in the early days and how many times she got turned down, and I do think that's really meaningful, and yes, I think that there is a correlation between a lack of diversity on the cap table and lack of diversity in portfolios.
Great. And I think just one more. What surprised you the most moving between public and versus private sector?
I think what surprised me the most is actually the similarities between the two, because the fact that the term public-private partnership exists shows that there is this inherent kind of disparity. And yes, sure, lots of things are different, but in terms of the sort of human side of things, the organizational side of things, the power dynamics, and frankly, the politics that transcend both public and private worlds, there's actually a lot of similarity. There's a book about Frances Perkins, who was the woman behind the New Deal, which is actually the name of the book, who is responsible for the creation of fair labor laws and, of Social Security. That actually, for me, was one of the most powerful books I read about my role today and leadership in this industry, even though she was, a civil servant, because it's about, how you get shit done, and especially how you do so in a predominantly male field. And so I think there are a lot of similarities when it comes to like leadership and actually moving the needle from a change perspective.
Amazing. Deena Shakir, a partner at Lux Capital. Thank you so much. This has been so fun. And thank you, Zara, for having us.
Thank you, Candy. I always love chatting with you. And Zara, thank you.